on to this now. The ANC has reiterated its desire to amend the Political Party Funding Act to raise the limits on donations from 15 million rand a year to 100 million rand. This as the governing party seeks to raise adequate funding for its December elective Congress amid a string of debts. Meanwhile, the country's Electoral Authority says it intends to strengthen its investigative capacity to probe transgressions by parties. The new donation legislation bans foreign funding, and the biggest deterrent for donors is the requirement for disclosure. Joining us now to explore this topic are IEC Vice Chairperson Janet Love, ANC spokesperson Pule Mabe, Angelo Fick, Director at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, and DA Federal Finance Chairperson Dion. Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Let's begin with the ANC, of course, who are making this proposal. The feeling, Pule, is that elected leaders have limited ability to improve the conditions of working people if they are beholden to the power of private money. What's the ANC's position on that?
Well, even in Tabo, even to the viewers and to the fellow panelists, the African National Congress took this view back at its NGC in 2000 when it spoke about the sense of incumbency, having looked at how money works to influence positions of the organization. At its conference of 2012, resolved on the Political Party Funding Act to try and remove any private capital from influencing policy positions or policy directions that the party is expected to take. We reaffirmed the same position again at the 2017 conference here in Nazareth. So we are in full support of the Political Party Funding Act. We believe that it is a necessary trajectory to be able to deepen our own democratic dispensation, to allow for plurality of views, many other political parties to participate. We have raised our issues as it relates to limitations or the cap currently attached to how much an entity could be able to put forward as a donation within the allowable window period of making such donations. Yeah. This does not necessarily say that we want to move away from that whole paradigm of transparency to allow for us to be able to be transparent. The ANC is the one party, perhaps with a few others, that has been very transparent about its own funding. Every time the IEC publishes disclosures, the ANC is there because we do those. We do submit those returns. Yeah. We are able to indicate what donations we have been able to receive within a period.
But is the ANC that's also quick to say the reason that you're facing trouble with your employees right now and yes, unable to meet your requirements is because of the Political Funding Act?
Yes, because of the cap. It's not because of the political.
Yeah. So essentially, you're saying, yes, let's have the Political Funding Act, but allow us to get 100 million.
Yes, let's increase the cap. For instance, political parties, and some of them you would have, say, you have got investment companies that you have got either relations or associated or attached to. Yeah. So they want to make that, but because they are companies, they can only make 15 million rand available. Yeah. If they have made more in that year, they are able to give you what allows you to run your own operations. Right. The reason we want to do this is because we want to avoid any form of any underhand. Things must be transparent. We need to be able to indicate that this is how much we've been able to raise. I know that there's been a debate even around the cap that individuals can make. I mean, there's a cap that is now placed at 100,000. There has been an issue as well with that. We don't have an issue with disclosures. We say we have said this must happen, so that we are able to make sure that there is transparency. Right. We could be able to strengthen our own democratic order and allow for many other voices to participate out there, knowing that they could be able to go and raise monies without them being beholden to those that would have funded them to direct their own policy positions.
So as far as the IEC is concerned, what's the main purpose of these donation limits? And do these limits in any way influence how then, therefore, later contracts are dispersed, procurement is dispersed to the various donors?
So first of all, I think it is a political decision regarding the sort of levels of disclosure, the levels of, or the limits rather, that are placed on funding. Because in a number of jurisdictions around the world, there is in fact a recognition that the state needs to be giving a significant amount of resources in order to exclude any direct private funding. In our country, it's a bit of a mixed system that has been adopted. And I think the limits are different, not just in terms of individuals and corporates, but are the limits that try and distinguish between what is a domestic donation versus any kind of international donation for purposes of training and policy development. So I think that the decision has been, at the moment, the country isn't in a position where it can exclude, this is a political decision, cannot exclude private direct funding, because the state is not in a position to fund political parties, right, or has felt that it's not in a position to fund political parties to the point where it can exclude direct private funding. I think that's one part of the decision. The second part of the decision is to make the limits on international funding very, very high. From the perspective of the Independent Electoral Commission, ours is firstly to make sure that the disclosure is comprehensive. Secondly, that part of monitoring that disclosure is not just monitoring by the Commission, but through the Commission's publication of its annual report, which is due to take place around November of this year. Included in that annual report will be the audited statements of each of the political parties, so that the media, civil society are able to scrutinize, to see whether or not, from the perspective of what has been observed, the necessary level of transparency has been complied with. So I think that from the perspective of the Commission, what we are aiming to do is to make sure that that disclosure is as comprehensive as it needs to be. Regarding the issue about whether or not there should be this mixed, state funding and private sector funding, I think that there are arguments, both ways. I think if I look at, countries, just recently, Angola has had its election. The issue there is that there isn't direct private funding that's allowed. It is all supposed to come as part of the campaigning process from the state. Yeah. I'm not sure that our public at the moment would feel that the level of increase that would be required would be warranted to be given to political parties. In that Angola situation, did it reduce the role of money in politics? The role of money in politics, I think, is something that is, I would say it reduced the perception, let me put it that way, of private sector engagement in politics. Did it reduce the role of money in politics? I'm not sure. Because in the case of a country like Angola, there were many concerns about the fact that some of that money, which came from a majority party government, was dispersed at a later stage than the opposition parties were comfortable with. Yeah. So there are different ways in which money obviously does play a role. Right. Money is certainly an influential
Let's
factor.
Bring Angelo Fick here. Angelo, how easy is it from a perspective of what we have observed in the country before the Political Party Funding Act was in place? How easy is it to observe systematically how politicians have benefited their donors?
So I think we need to draw a distinction between intra-party funding issues and how money works inside political parties in their campaigns, and how they work at election time for the relationship between donors and the electorate. Pule Mabe mentions transparency and accountability. Now, if one is, and I understand all political parties have a survival mechanism that kicks in and the ability to pay their staff and to run their business. But as citizens, what we would want, I imagine, in a constitutional democracy is total transparency and total accountability. Now, that doesn't exist anywhere in the world because there are ways around all of the rules that you set up. So Ms. Love talks about, among other places, Angola. But the really scary stories about the relationship between private funding and domestic politics come out of the first world. We've just seen the Mercer Corporation and family and their influence in the politics of the United States by funding the kind of think tanks that shift the political discourse to the right. We in South Africa have a public broadcaster, which means that the corporate broadcasting news sector does not have the kind of sway that it has in those countries. In the United Kingdom, we've certainly seen the way in which private donor funding coming out of Russian oligarchs living in the UK shifted political discourse on a whole variety of questions. So when we sit in South Africa, we need to be very careful to assume that the functioning of parties is the primary question here. Yes, they should function, but their accountability to the electorate, to the citizens, to the people who live here, whose policies are going to govern them, should be absolutely transparent. And Pablo Iglesias from Podemos in Spain points out that you can trace the way in which legislation funded by particular corporations lead not only to those, laws being made by the ministers or members of the legislatures, but when those people retire from the legislatures, they take up positions in those corporations that funded them. And we've certainly seen a revolving door between corporate South Africa and governing South Africa in a way that ought to set up our alarm bells and make us a little bit more sensitive. Yeah. And we've just got over the Bosasa issue as well.
Dion, a recent report from the IEC indicate, I think in this quarter you might have received the most donations from all indications. Do privately donor-funded political parties or politicians, including yourselves, benefit donors disproportionately?
Well, I think you need to take a step back. I mean, we have a democracy in South Africa, and democracy costs money. And if you're going to have political parties that operate in that democracy, they need money to function. And the question is, how do they actually function? Now, it's been mentioned quite a lot that, you have donors and they influence your policy, they influence legislation, etc. That depends on how you run your organization. For example, in the DA, it is very clear that there is no correlation between money that we receive from a donor and the action of the party or the policy of the party. There is no correlation between that. It is how you manage your party. Yeah.
Is there a correlation between that and the contracts that are issued to donors?
No, definitely not. The argument is that if you're going to be giving money to a political party, there's going to be a quid pro quo, and then they're going to approve contracts with you, developments, etc. Now, that is not so. And if there's an argument for that, then there needs to be evidence. South Africa is a very young democracy, as we know. And if we're going to develop our democracy sensibly, so that in many years from now we've got very robust institutions, we've got to make sure that our political parties function and that our system functions. And if you starve political parties of money, they cannot function. So, for example, if you look at the disclosures, for example, the DA did not support the Political Party Funding Act at the outset. And the reason why we didn't do that was we said that we do not believe that our democracy is mature enough and that people would be concerned that if there was a disclosure that they were giving money to, for example, the opposition party, that there would be negative consequences for them. That was our argument before the Act was implemented. Subsequently to the Act being in place, it is very clear that donor behavior has changed. So, for example, there are people that don't want their donation to be disclosed. We know 100,000 Rand is the disclosure limit, and there is a limit on the amount of money that one individual or entity can pay per annum. And that does impact. It has impacted on the functioning of the Democratic Alliance. We knew before the Act was finalized that the government money, the statutory funding to the party was going to be reduced. So we did our projections and we actually did retrench staff as a result of that because we were not going to be getting the same amount of statutory money. If you look at other income streams, and that's the donor income stream, you cannot use government statutory money for various political activities. And we do not break the rules in the DA. Yeah. So you have to get donor income to pay for that income stream.
Right.
So it does impact. And as I say, it's how you run your organization.
Yeah.
If you are an organization that is going to be corrupt and misbehave, well, then you're gonna do that with your donor income.
Yeah.
We do believe in transparency,
Yeah.
but we do not believe that the Political Party Funding Act is actually doing what it was purported to do.
How do we measure that, Janet? How do we measure the impact? I mean, since we have the Political Party Funding Act in place right now, have we seen, for example, a reduction in contracts being given to donors? Have we seen politicians behaving differently?
I think that we have seen, as has been said, that there has been a holding back. Certainly, it's been reported to us that there's been a holding back. Political parties have said by certain people who historically have given donations, and the fact of disclosure has made people more hesitant. Our response to that really is that there is an obligation for the public, as I think Professor Fick has just said, to be aware of where support is coming from, and so that in order to be able to assess, as members of the public, members of the media, etc., to assess whether or not that relationship is one of a kind of general policy alignment from a particular donor with a political party, or whether there are other favors that emerge, maybe not the day after, not blatantly, but whether they emerge. I think the second thing for us is that we are saying to donors, if there's a hesitation because, and there is no evidence that any donor that has given to an opposition party has been treated in a particularly negative way or whatever in any of the kind of government spheres. So it might be, but we have received no evidence. But what we do say to donors who have that kind of hesitation is we have a multi-party democracy fund as well. So if donors choose not to give directly to individual political parties, we're saying support multi-party democracy.
Yeah.
I think it's the transparency that is owed to citizens that the Commission has seen as being a very important factor.
Yes. Pule, let me ask you directly, do you do favors? Do you give favors to donors?
Well,
and how transparent are you in that process?
We don't have to. Not at all. We don't have to. Actually, most of those that would have disclosed their details to have funded the ANC don't even do business with government. Yeah. As a result, they don't.
That is the perception. I mean, I'm talking now in terms of contestations, right? Because there are a lot of people within your own party who are asking for the disclosure of the CR17 bank accounts, because there's a sense, there's a feeling that there are favors that have been done for people who donated to that campaign.
Well, those are matters that are being ventilated before a court of law. I wouldn't want to get into that. They will distract me from the main issue. Well, we don't do favors to anyone who is making funding towards the ANC. We believe that the Political Party Funding Act is the step in the right direction. It allows for disclosures to be made. It allows for transparency. It allows for the safeguarding of our own democratic order.
Yeah. What's the worst that will happen if that threshold is not lifted? Will it limit your campaigns in any way? Will it adversely affect the voter?
Well, like all laws are reviewed. I mean, the Political Party Funding Act has just been introduced now. So like any other law, laws are reviewed. So we will not have known what to expect. So there are lessons learned. We have seen the constraints, because we would want to disclose, account, be transparent about the funding that we are receiving. The reason why we are calling for the cap to be increased is to allow for us to be able to finance our own activities, campaigns and all of that. I mean, the biggest project that any political party runs is elections. You know, you have to do pamphlets, do print merchandise and all of it. Takes a lot of money. You take care of your volunteers. So you need to make sure that at least there is a kitty within your own public funding arrangements, within your own donation, that allows you to do this work. I mean, if you can't rely on your subscriptions. The ANC did try to introduce crowdfunding. But you see, the culture of crowdfunding in South Africa is not as entrenched as it is in other established democracies. Because if it was, just with its own membership network alone, the ANC would be able to run. Because subscriptions are not supposed to really be disclosed there, because it's 100 rand, it's 500 rand. So if you sit with a membership of well over 1 million, and each one of your member was only paying about 10 rand or what, let's say 50 rand a month, or those that could be able to afford, you can immediately calculate how much will be coming, which is what the panelists from the DA had raised. You'll have to look at your different income streams. What is it that the ANC now as an organization relies on to be able to generate its own income? Is the grants, mandatory grants that we get from the IEC proportional to the seats that we occupy in Parliament? Is the donations that we make? Is subscriptions? It's levies that our members pay, members of Parliament, members of legislatures, and councillors, those that are in the employ of the ANC sitting in a certain threshold, are able to pay those kind of levies. But are they enough? With the situation that we have seen, unfortunately, we took a decision as the ANC post-COVID, even during the when COVID-19 was ravaging the country, that we are not going to be retrenching our staff. What did this mean? This meant that we had to look at other alternative ways through which we'll be able to sustain the workforce. That is what is sometimes leading us to the kind of challenges that we are facing. But if the cap was much higher, we will be able to meet our own obligations. Because like I've said, political parties may have their own investment companies that play, and these investment companies could be able to say, from what we have been able to generate in this financial year, we will be able to offload 50 million. But if you are only saying give 15 million when you can actually give 50, it's not helpful.
Okay.
Because these commercial entities are established to allow parties to be able to function without having to rely a lot on private capital.
Yeah. Angelo, some literature available seems to indicate, for example, if you were to move the kind of loosening of donation limits that the ANC is proposing from 15 million to about 100 million, the net effect of that would simply be that, yes, we're going to see probably more donors coming in, will probably a representation of a rise of about 20%, but also we're going to see more favors actually being distributed the way of the donors. What's your feeling? What would be the net effect of lifting that donation limit?
So lifting the donation limit, you can put mechanisms in place to prevent the kind of, cash for honours or cash for positions or cash for contracts. That is possible. Whether it's possible in a South Africa where the civil service and regulatory authorities have been kneecapped in the way that they have is a different question. But there are larger questions about policy development, and certainly in South Africa, while we can talk about, the questionability of the relationship between individual funders and contracts down to local government level, at the level of policy making, much of what the ANC has to take some responsibility for is that over the last 25 years, its national policy directives have often been to the benefit of larger corporations that have been inside its beneficiary circle, and not necessarily to the millions of people who are in outright protest every day around service delivery failures. Secondly, at the municipal level, questions about land usage, allocation of land development, poor housing development, social housing development, all of these questions come into play when you start looking at the directives that those in power, the decisions that they make around that land usage that may not necessarily benefit company X specifically, but certainly would benefit the corporate sector that funds that party more than the 10 million citizens who live in the metropole or live in the city or live in the region. So those are issues that we need to also be aware of. It isn't always just a matter of you pay us 10 million and we'll give you the contract to develop a dam or a thing, on the side. Sometimes it is pro-capital policy that is shaped by the government that is elected because they're funded in that way. Secondly, the question of what the amount is secondary. The issue is transparency. If people are willing to say, listen, I funded party X, then that's what they should be able to do, because as a voter, as a citizen, I should know who is funding my political parties, because the global record is not good for where political party funding becomes less transparent. We've seen the extreme example in the United States with the Mercer family. I've mentioned that. We've seen what happened in British politics with the oligarchs. We've seen what happens in very corrupt political systems like Italy. And we've certainly seen it across the African continent in the DRC at the moment, where mining corporations are driving all sorts of strange political agendas inside the country that are to the detriment not just of that country and its people, but to the larger issue around climate catastrophe, fossil fuels, minerals exploration, forest destruction. So we need to be very clear that in South Africa, we cannot have a situation where people are allowed to give large amounts of money to our politicians, and then we sit with energy policies that are made to the benefit of those donors and not to us.
Quick one, Dion, we have about 2 minutes left. What's the feeling of the Democratic Alliance on the loosening of the limits on donations? I think Dion could have been frozen there. All right, we'll have to leave it there for tonight, unfortunately, because of time. But I appreciate you all. Thank you very much for coming in. Janet, thank you very much for coming in. It's been a long day for you. And Angelo, much appreciated. Thanks for coming on. We'll keep taking your thoughts. 072-110-5584. You can tweet us at Newzroom 405. We'll read those throughout the show tonight.